Hello, this is Chuck Stull looking at the oligopolistic structure and behavior of the big three during their prime years. So for decades, three producers, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, dominated the US auto industry. These were all located and headquartered in Southeast Michigan. They were highly interdependent and they were generally very cooperative. And that led to some substantial differences than what we would see in a more competitive market such as agriculture. Let me start by looking at pricing. The auto industry seemed to follow a price leadership model. General Motors, as the industry leader, typically would set prices during this time period, and then Ford and Chrysler, very much aware of the interdependence, would match the price for equivalent kinds of cars. Occasionally, Ford or Chrysler would announce their new model year prices first, and it looked like what they were trying to do was predict what General Motors' decision would be. This was particularly noticeable when GM came in significantly higher or lower, and the early announcer revised its prices to match General Motor prices. A second interesting part of pricing is that pricing in automobiles has not been broadly based on the cost of production. Typically, companies would set an overall profit target and they would earn much higher prices, earn higher profits on the higher priced larger cars. Now, the cost of producing a larger car is quite modest. Essentially, a lot of what you are putting inside there, what consumers are buying, is space, right? Is air that doesn't really cost very much. But firms increase their markup, their profit margin substantially, so that the price differential is much higher than the cost. Right? Essentially, there are dimensional economies in automobiles, but the auto industry was charging much higher for the bigger cars. Essentially, what they were doing is pricing off the demand curve, and that's only possible if there's market power. To a large extent, this pricing structure continues today. A few years ago, I was looking for a new car, and I was on a Toyota lot, and there were three models. I was interested in the RAV4, which was selling for about $25,000. Um, but the Highlander and the Sequoia were also available on the same lot. Um, Often I'd be going in the evening to avoid the car salesman, and so I'd pull up to a car thinking it was one model and it would turn out to be another. Now, the differences in size of these cars wasn't very big. The RAV4 was 180 inches. The Highlander was 188 inches, so about 8 inches longer. But the price was substantially higher. The RAV4 was selling for about $25,000. A similarly equipped Highlander was $35,000, so an extra $10,000 for a little bit extra metal. The Sequoia, which was the biggest car at 205 inches, was selling for twice the cost of the RAV4 at $50,000, and it certainly wasn't costing the car company twice as much to produce. So this is a long time and ongoing aspect of the auto industry. Now, if you're not setting price based on marginal cost, if you're choosing prices based on the demand curve, there's some interesting possibilities. And price discrimination exists if you can charge different prices to different customers. Right, so price discrimination simply says we have multiple prices for the same product. Now, a price discriminating monopolist can be even more profitable than a regular monopoly. So let me look at just a simple graph here. So here's an ordinary supply and demand graph. We have the downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, which in this case is labeled MC for marginal cost, because we're looking at a non-competitive industry. Now, we could all put in the competitive price and quantity, looking at the intersection of those two curves. And of course, that would be the socially optimal, the one that maximizes consumer plus producer surplus. We could also draw the monopoly price. We would want to add a marginal revenue curve that's going to be twice as steep as the demand curve and beneath the demand curve. And we'd look for the intersection of marginal cost and marginal revenue, and that will give us um, a monopoly price and quantity. So it might look something like this. And again, just for simplicity, I've left the marginal revenue curve off there, but it should, if I had drawn it, it would intersect where um, the marginal cost curve right where that yellow line intersects it. So this would be an ordinary monopolist, right, charging a price substantially higher than the competitive price, but trading that off by producing a lower quantity. Now that's not the very best a monopolist could do. If you could price discriminate, we can see that there are some people up at the top of the demand curve, right to the leftmost part of the graph, who would be willing to pay even more for our automobile. Right? And if we could separate them out, if we could identify them and sell to them separately, we could have a two-tiered pricing system, maybe something like this, where we find those people who are willing to pay the most and charge them that P1, and then the other people we would just charge the regular monopoly price here labeled P2. Now, again, if we're price discriminating monopolist, we could do even better than this because we do see there are some people who we're not serving, people where we could produce a car at below what they're willing to pay for it, right? So there are some net benefits. So these would be people to the right, right? So between the second yellow vertical line and the intersection of our marginal cost and demand curve. So we could, if we can price discriminate, set a third price, which is lower than the monopoly price, and charge just that extra group, charge them that lower price. So we'd have the people who are willing to pay the most um, paying P1, people in the middle paying P2, and people who are less willing to pay, we're paying P3. And our overall quantity would be adding up all of those, and we can see it's almost out to where the competitive equilibrium would be. So this is a really profitable situation for a firm if they can do it. The producer surplus increases. It's essentially all of the areas under each of those, each of the yellow rectangles. And the consumer surplus is shrinking. It's just the little triangles left above the yellow lines. Now, it would be even better if you could charge every single person. This is better for the monopolist, not better for the consumers, but it would be better for the firm if you could charge every single consumer their own maximum willingness to pay. And so we would have a whole stream of different prices running from the intersection of the demand curve with the vertical axis and running all the way down to the competitive price. And every consumer would pay all of their willingness to pay to the firm, the whole area under the demand curve all the way out to the intersection of marginal cost and demand would become revenue for the firm, and producer surplus would be that minus the cost of production. Right? That is often hard to do. So how did firms price discriminate? One way was to segment the market, right? To have a real basic version of a car. This would be the low markup cheap car, and then they would add options to a loaded car that would be willing to appeal to buyers who were willing to pay more. So, I don't know, about 10 years ago, my wife bought a Subaru Legacy, and it was a four-wheel drive station wagon made by Subaru, and she paid $20,000 for it. Now, on the same day, someone we knew happened to be buying a Subaru Outback, same kind of car from the same company, again, a four-wheel drive station wagon. It had some extra trim. It was a special color. It had some plastic body panels, and it had the Eddie Bauer trim package. That car cost a full 50% higher than my wife's car, even though when they were pulled up next to each other for us to pick them up, The only difference seemed to be that one was silver and one was silvery green. Right, but 20,000 versus 30,000 would be some market segments. Dealers, of course, have a separate area where they can price discriminate, and that is most cars are not sold for their sticker price, and that individual negotiation is a way that car dealers can extract higher willingness to pay from consumers. Consumers who are willing to pay less will end up getting a lower price. So price discrimination in the auto industry comes really in two places. One is how much higher we're charging for certain options, and then the second is the different prices that dealers negotiate for exactly the same car with different customers. Now, another place where pricing was really interesting is replacement part pricing. So the demand for replacement parts is very inelastic, much more so than cars in general. So someone might be considering a Ford or a Chevy or a Toyota or a Honda, right? So good competition to start with. But when a car owner needs a part, it has to be one that is specific to that car. They can't buy a door or a body panel for another car and make it fit. So that gives the owners a very inelastic demand, and so that the auto companies found that they could charge a very high price for the replacement parts. They were a very profitable item for them. Essentially, this is the holdup problem. If we looked at the cost of buying every single part in a car, it would exceed the cost of buying a brand new car by a lot, and that's not even putting it together. Now, there were some limits to market power. Is that people could buy used parts from a car that had been in a wreck, perhaps, and those would compete with the replacement parts from the original equipment manufacturer. People could buy stolen parts. Chop shops would steal cars and break them into pieces because the components were more valuable than the car itself. And we also saw prices that were so high that it overcame the huge advantage in economies of scale from body part stamping and allowed entry by replacement part makers, right? So ones who were not the original, one of the big three or the other international brands, right? But were just simply an independent part maker who could come in cheaper because the markup wasn't as high. So if we look at the U.S. auto industry towards the middle to the end of the 20th century, we had a oligopoly that had been very profitable with high prices for the products, high profits for the car makers, and high wages for the workers. And that made Michigan a very comfortable place to live. There were lots of good, high-paying jobs, both amongst well-paid union workers and well-compensated management. And it became easy to be complacent. But even in that era, which in some ways was the golden era for Michigan's auto industry, it wasn't problem-free. So the demand for cars has always been sensitive to changes in income and changes in interest rates. An automobile is an expensive purchase. Most buyers need to buy loans to afford a car, and so when the interest rates go up, the cost of the car would go up and the quantity purchased would drop. Cars are also a big fraction of a consumer's budget, and so when people's income went down, they typically would not be able to afford a new car. And because cars are durable, right, unlike food and gasoline that we've talked about earlier, consumers can wait to buy. You can hold the car that you have perhaps another year or two, making some repairs as needed. So the industry was very accustomed to a business cycle. When we went into a recession or when interest rates would go up, car sales would drop and there would be layoffs and workers would be able to collect unemployment compensation. And then when the economy recovered, people would be called back to work and would go back to happily to their well-paid auto jobs. Now, another problem that wasn't immediately apparent is that product competition beyond styling was fairly limited. Right? So the oligopolistic structure had eased price competition, but it also limited non-price competition. So the big three were very slow to introduce new products like small cars. And the idea was that coming in with a small car with low prices would undercut rivals and lead to lower profits. And so what seemed to happen is that none of the big three wanted to introduce um, a small car until the market had developed well enough to become large enough that all three producers could profitably compete there. And so that market for small cars really didn't develop in the United States from the US automakers, but as we'll see in a later slideshow, from the foreign imports. The big three, while they were the biggest and very highly profitable um, car makers worldwide, they were slow to introduce features like fuel injection, disc brakes, rack and pinion steering, radial tires, quartz headlights, 5-speed manual transmission. These were all things that came um, not from the big three, but from um, international competitors. So the golden years saw a really minor really minor innovations from about 1949 when automatic transmissions were broadly introduced until the late 70s. And part of this is that if one of the car companies introduced a new feature, it would be immediately matched by rivals, and so that there would be no profits from having those new features. Another thing that the car industry was criticized for is being slow to introduce safety features. The industry belief back in that era was that safety don't sell. And so there were patents from the big three on safety features that came out decades before they were implemented in the actual automobiles. And that went back all the way to the 1920s and 30s with padded dashboards and collapsible steering wheels to a very slow introduction of airbags in the late 1990s. In some cases, the automakers resisted installing safety equipment until they were forced to by government regulation. Now, one place we did see a substantial amount of competition was in marketing. The big three spent quite a bit on advertising, and they also spent quite a bit on fashion and trim and style in order to make their cars look new and flashy, and to make the older cars look out of fashion in a sort of planned obsolescence. So this was a great time for Michigan in terms of profits and in terms of wages, but that tight-knit, profitable oligopoly did not last. By the 1980s, there were losses in sales. The firms were earning losses. Chrysler had its first bankruptcy and its first bailout, and we will look at some of those auto industry changes in our next presentation. This has been Chuck Stahl from Kalamazoo College. Thank you for listening.